First, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to come out today. We still expect a few others to join us. We welcome you to the Expenditure Plan Advisory Committee meeting. I'm Ben Strumwasser with Circle Point. We've been asked to help this multidisciplinary plan development team, and in particular, help with the facilitation. So on the agenda for today are some general items, convening the meeting, which we're doing now, public comment, which we'll ask for in just a moment. If you do have a comment, be sure you fill out a public comment form. That's the small white card. And these are for items that are not on the agenda. So I want to make that clear that the public comment during this session is for any comments that are not, or any items that are not on today's agenda. And then call your attention to two important handouts. One is the EPAC meeting calendar, subsequent meetings on April 7th and in May if needed. You'll see those. And then also the action item log as well. So that was the information I wanted to get out to you. With respect to the other items on the agenda, item 1, Ross is going to talk about where we are, and I'll talk a little bit about the expectations for today's meetings and the desired outcomes for today's meeting. And then we'll complete the review of the initial draft TEP, which we were here a week ago working on, and we'll try to get that done quickly enough so then we'll have a chance to go around and get feedback from folks. You should have also gotten the public input form that you may have filled it out already, or you may be filling it out further. This is, of course, for the EPAC members, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Finally, we'll talk about the next steps, and we'll do everything we can to end the meeting as we're planning to at 4 o'clock. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to actually, let me open it up to public comments. Any public comments on items not on the agenda? Okay. If there are any public comments on the other items, please be sure that you mark that item with the white card, and otherwise we'll proceed now. So, Ross, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Ben. So, again, thank you all for being here, and we're pretty excited about where we are here in the process. I think this may be the high point. I don't know, maybe we're going to get a little higher, who knows. But now, at least for us in this group, I think we're really in the meat of it, trying to get your input and reaction to the initial draft. And certainly we've heard a lot of comments so far, and appreciate that. So again, just kind of real high level of where we are, where we're going. A couple of things that were in your mail-out packet. You've seen this before, path to the TEP. So again, broken down into 3 major phases: developing the draft, commenting and refining, reviewing that draft, and then the CCTA board will adopt a final draft and then seek to get approval of that from cities and the Board of Supervisors. So we're wrapping up this last steps, or some of the last steps of this first phase to develop the draft TEP. So we want to complete our review today of that with you, get some more comments, walk through the rest of the packet, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what I call the handout. I think some people or not handout, the homework. Some people are calling it an input sheet. I think it's homework. So hopefully you all can get a nice gold star for doing your homework. And we hope to, our plan is to synthesize that and get what we hope to be some themes, some thumbs up, thumbs down on certain things. Are there trends where we have some commonality? And then we have a hunch, and we want to verify this, that there's probably about a half a dozen or so major discussion items yet that need to be haggled out, and that's what we anticipate we'll see from that, and we'll see once you provide the rest of your input. And just as a separate point of data point here, our regional committees we have the four regional committees around the county. They're also in different states of reviewing and commenting on the draft as well. We've had very productive discussions with a number of individuals and the small groups that we've been describing, and I think you'll see a lot of results of that as we go through the agenda here today. So again, thank you all for participating in that. Some of the key topic items that we're working on with those groups are the growth management program, including some comments about the urban limit line. I think we're getting very close to having a complete streets program that folks can live with. And then we're looking at a couple options for incentivizing infill. And one of the common themes is that we need to address the housing crisis in the Bay Area. And by doing that, that's not making this a housing measure, but if we can address smart growth, smart housing, coupled with a robust transportation system, it just makes the system more efficient if we can build one around the other. And both are a little bit in place, so we need to be smart about how we continue to develop. Reviewing the rest of the timeline here, we hope that by the end of March that our board will have taken your comments on the comments that we've received to date and released a draft plan. So, and then we'll come back to you. So more than anything else, I think one of the takeaways I want you to get from us in this meeting is this isn't the last chance you're going to have to comment on where we are in the process. Clearly, we'll be the first ones to say that the draft that you've been reviewing needs work. So we're not going to go in the back room and fix it and then go on our way. Once the board takes their action at the end of March, we'll be back here to get your comments again. Did we hit the mark? Are we off the mark? What do we continue to need work on? So again, this isn't the end. Maybe some of us would like to see it be the end, but we're going to continue seeking your comment and participation. So I appreciate you hanging with us so far, and want to thank you in advance for continuing to work with us. So I think that's all I want to do on the introduction is, again, we're really in the meat of things. A lot of good participation, a lot of good comments. Thank you for all that, and we'll continue to seek your input as we go forward. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Ross. Want to go ahead and see if there's any comments or discussion from the EPAC members on item 1. Yes, please.
I hope this is relevant to item 1. It's kind of a general question that doesn't fit into any of the specific categories. So first, I actually just want to express appreciation for the openness of staff and consultants to input so far. I think the comment log is a great way of tracking the comments we've made and making sure that they are addressed.
Excuse me, can you hear him in the back? Is everything okay? Good. Great. Thank you. Sorry.
So that said, I do have a general question about the proposals for the funding categories. I understand that the RTPCs have proposals of their own with list of categories, and I don't understand how that relates to the county level TEP.
I'll answer it first, and then Bill can answer it, and his answer will probably be tempered by the fact he can't get fired. So the regional committees are really bread and butter of how we do business here, and it goes back to 1988 when the first measure passed. For some people, they may not know that there was a ballot measure in '86 that did not pass. And a lot of lessons learned from that. And one of them was really that, we need to recognize that we have a very different areas in the county. So we embedded in that first measure the need for cooperative planning, and the cooperative planning was through these 4 committees. So the first step we took on this process was to ask our TPCs for their input, primarily on the investments. We didn't ask them a lot of questions about some of the policies that were in Measure J. Did they work? Did they not work? Are there more policies? But at least they got their initial input on the projects and programs. So they've been waiting patiently for us to provide a response to that. And that's really, this draft TEP was really the first response to that input, both from the investments as well as the discussion about the different policies. So part of our our process of doing business is to work cooperatively with RTPCs. We ask them to get the cities that are in the region together and discuss it and hash it out and then feed it to us. So it's I don't know if that's answering your question, but it's just how we do business. And actually, I tried to we had addressed that. I didn't, we've seen this again, but this is another handout another diagram I included in the packet specifically for this, is the board is taking input from the EPAC, RTPCs, and the public. So we're trying to have this broad outreach of, some people would call it the inside baseball folks, so that's the RTPCs, and then we have the public, some represented here on the EPAC and other more direct public outreach that we've been doing as well.
Bill, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I think in terms of process, I think it's part of the question in terms of what to expect in the future. I think that I would just keep reminding, as Ross did, everybody of the process we're going through. We've collected a lot of comments from this group, and we expect to get a number of more today. Then we basically start with the board on the 9th, and we expect as staff and the consultant team to issue an updated staff recommendation after the first meeting of the board. That would be version 2 of this draft. The board at that point is going to, the question amongst them at that point is getting this draft ready for official review. The official review being your group again in April or so, but all the RTPCs and all the cities. So it's going to be up to the board to resolve the inputs that they're getting in various points. But the next output of the staff consultant team will be an updated version of this, version 2.0 that we're calling it. And at that point, you'll be able to see kind of how we have modified, if at all, recommendations based on, we're getting continuous input from a lot of different sources. And, we're going to have to just weigh all that. And at the end of the day, the board's going to say we missed that point or we overshot something or whatever. But there is significant difference amongst a lot of folks. But the board at the end of the day is going to have to resolve that. So I think the answer to the question is that this is an ongoing process. And the real fun, I think, is going to begin after the board releases a draft for comment, because it'll come out at the end of March. There'll be a 2-month period, and then the board in May will have the opportunity to basically, in effect, say, this is the plan that we want the voters to look at. And I can tell you there'll be a lot of discussion, angst, pro and con, and lots of stuff in between. So I caution everybody to just kind of stand by. The most important thing today and the outcome that we really want is to make sure that we've captured all of the comments that this group and all of you individually have, and that we're reflecting that appropriately in the documents that we give to the board. And then, quite honestly, one of the things I would hope that we get out of today and this exercise we've talked about is some priorities. Now, what are the top 5, top 6 issues as you see it that where we need more work, we need more focus, we need more something in order to make this a document that, because what we want to do is come back to this group and have all of you say you just hit a home run. This is great. We love this document.
All
I'm
right.
not sure that's going to happen, but that's ideal.
Any other? Yeah.
Could I just follow up?
Go ahead.
So if I'm understanding correctly, then, for example, when WICTAC produces a proposed set of percentages, that's for the same county level money that we're talking about here?
Yes.
Okay. And I also did
Well,
want to...
no. Let me answer that. There is no requirement that the funding level is the same in all 4 of the regions. So if that's your question, and one of the things that we talked a little bit about last meeting, we'll talk more about it today, is we've reserved a certain amount of money that's shown in here as a regional choice. That's their money to say, we'd like to bump up this or that. So I think if I understand your comment correctly, will the funding levels in each of the regions be identical? The answer to that is no.
Okay. And I also just would like to add a comment on a funding category we covered last week, if it's appropriate to do so in the next agenda item.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. All right, then we'll move on to item 2, to complete the review of the initial draft TEP. And as those of you who are here, most of you were, We went through the first part of that process, and we want to continue it now, and Ross will be doing that. Then we'll have an opportunity to hear some comments and discuss the next steps we're going to take.
All right, and Ivy is around somewhere to be our scribe. But again, the drill here is we're just going to walk through the remaining line items. We're going to try to do this relatively quickly because we do want to reserve some time for some of the more open dialogue we want to have in the meeting here. So the last time we were together, we made it through item 10, the Advanced Mitigation Program. I'm not going to bundle the items. We'll do them individually. But items 11 and 12, I was going to ask Peter Engel of CCTA staff to come up and just provide the very quick introduction to the topic and what some of the discussions have been, and then we'll open it up for comments again.
Hello. Ooh. I feel like a rock star. So item 11, non-rail transit enhancements. So this item was written the way it was because we don't know what's going to happen in 25 years regarding public transit or any other forms of transit, whether it be bus, which we all know bus is probably the technology right now, but those things can change over the next few to several short-term, long-term years of this measure. There is also information in here about how that'll be monitored, how projects will be set up with specific criteria regarding performance measures, connectivity potentially with other services, things that are important to the public in order to use public transit to get from home to work or home to school or other places. So a 2-year review, is the project meeting its goals? Is there corrective measures that can be taken place to help to meet those goals, or is it better that the funding actually get moved to a different transit or non-rail transit project? So the idea, working similar, I guess, to Regional Measure 2, where these transit projects are actually looked at regarding performance criteria, given an opportunity to have corrective action taken to improve them, and if not, then the funds will be moved to another program. Ross, do you want me to do the next program too while I'm here?
Well, why don't you just hang on just a sec, if you don't mind, Peter. So we did touch a little bit on this. I know Margaret made a comment. So again, you all had the comment log mailed out yesterday. There was a supplemental comment log to capture a few items that we didn't get on this log. So we did have a comment, number 44, from Margaret, and you can all look at that. They had a comment 49 from WICTAC. So again, the types of questions we're looking for is this an appropriate category to be in the measure? Does the description kind of look and feel like what we should be funding with these dollars? And if we have any sense about, should the funding be higher or lower? Those are the types of comments we want. Of course, you can provide any comment, but that's kind of how we want to, the feedback that'd be most useful for us. So open it up for comments on item 11.
Okay, well, I think we were going to go through these.
No, we're going to do comments.
Okay, all right. So that's number 11 on our 12 to 20 list. Are members of the EPAG want to comment on those?
Ross, I had a question. With respect to the ranking, the homework that you gave us, is now the time? Are we going to be verbally talking about that? Are we?
We're going to try to get through this quickly so that we can.
So if, for example, if this was an area where we thought there should be less funding in this category.
You can comment on it now. And thank you. Actually, we should explain. We wanted to wait and ask you to complete that exercise till we complete the review, because some people might hear things and say, I feel different about this or that. So that's the idea, is we're going to give you about 10 minutes once we finish this review to see if you want to adjust anything.
Okay.
But this is like last time. We're just looking for comments or reaction to that category.
Okay, other comments? Yeah, over here.
So, thank you, Peter, for some clarification of questions we raised last week. I would say in addition to the public wanting performance measurements, the public wants safe and reliable service. So I think we really need to have a discussion about safety improvements aboard buses, the same as BART and other places. When you buy a new bus, it's in circulation about 12 years average. So saying that we don't know throughout the lifespan of this measure if buses are going to exist, that's a little, I guess, we know that it has to exist, at least half of it, but I think we'd like to see a greater, I just can't imagine buses not existing anymore in this county as a public transit option. So I think we really need to look at that. We can't, with paratransit, I don't see that same kind of questioning whether paratransit will be around. And I think it should be. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but I think that, this body, sort of throwing buses under the bus, as it were, is a real problem. And it's, I agree with the comment in number 49 for West County, but the people throughout if you look at the demographic shifts in Contra Costa County, many more transit-dependent people are moving further and further out in this country, in this county. And this is a national trend, and we just need to see the moderate income housing being created in the eastern part of the county. Folks need to have other options to get around. So that's, we're still not happy with this, but thank you for some of the clarification.
Okay, other comments on 11? Yes, Joel.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to echo Cheryl's comments. I unfortunately wasn't able to be here on the 23rd, and I wished I could have, because I would have challenged whoever was suggesting that we were asking funding for empty buses. I don't think, and I, as one of the louder advocates for transit on this committee, I don't think anybody has ever called for funding for empty buses. I think that what we've been saying is that if we're going to really grow ridership, we need to have more funding for buses that are currently half full or have the capacity for growth. And that would be buses that are along corridors that get people to work and provide people with a competitive alternative to the traditional single occupancy vehicle, or what we call cars. And I think that it would be a big mistake to suggest that we don't fund any kind of augmentation of service to BART stations, at least via buses, when we know that our BART stations are at capacity for parking lots and we don't have the capacity to build more parking lots. We might get a little money somehow to build a few more parking lots, but we're not going to do it with Uber and Lyft and whatever other technologies that we are also supportive of. But it is a mistake. I deeply believe it is a mistake to feel like we can get away with passing a measure that for whom many people who depend on buses and would like to depend on buses if they were there would be paying the most out of their pocket with respect to the way that this sales tax would work to actually augment the way that they get around. So I'm deeply, deeply discouraged and very sorry that I missed that last meeting, and I hope that this is still very far from where we need to be in talking about what we need to get less traffic on our major corridors. And I'm talking about Monument Boulevard, Ignacio Valley Boulevard, I'm talking about San Pablo Avenue, all these major corridors.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Other comments on 11 here, because we have a couple still to go. Yes, Joel, if you can be succinct.
I will be. I will direct people to hopefully what will be a resource that's not buried in some agenda somewhere. AC Transit made a fantastic presentation on the February the 17th CCTA Specialty EP meeting on their strategic plan for West County. And I thought they made a really compelling case for how they're going to achieve, why and how they're going to achieve greater transit ridership on their buses in West County, and what they need for resources in order to do so. And I know that many of the other operators are hoping to do that strategic planning with CCTA. So before we shortchange buses and assume that their ridership cannot achieve at certain levels, we should see that kind of level of planning and investment in the appropriately sized and operational bus system throughout the entire county. And one of the things that I'd like to note as well is one of the things that kept coming up time and time again is about closures in bus gaps. And so I'd like to see that this TEP specifically address some of the egregious gaps in bus service in the county so that people can get to services, jobs, housing throughout the entire county.
Great, thank you, Joel. Yes, Rita. Then we'll move on to 12.
Yeah.
You have to be very close.
If
You're
you're,
not real good.
if you're real close.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
that'll
different.
help.
First question.
That would help. And on that note, I'd like to say that there are areas in bus service in this county that are severely lacking. One of them is kind of incredible that you have to wait an hour to an hour and 20 minutes for a bus on some lines, on some routes. Mm-hmm. That's just not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. The service needs to be increased,
Thank you, Rita.
especially now that I'm coming to this end of the county all the time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me move on to 12
Yeah,
then.
let's move on to 12. And again, I'm going to ask Peter to just do a very brief introduction. I think this is kind of an exciting section, and he can speak to it much better than I.
Can you hear me? I guess so. So item 12 is transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. As far as the title, I think that's the one most people can relate to that title better. What we generally refer to it in the writing is accessible transportation services. And the concept here is that similar to the current Measure J, these would augment the current Measure J and that they can be used for ADA, non-ADH services. But we're also trying to introduce a new thing here called mobility management, which is supported strongly by the Federal Transit Administration. There's funding that goes towards this. And what mobility management is it looks at all the transportation services that are available out there, not just public services, not just services provided by transit operators that are ADA services or some cities that provide services for senior populations, but it also looks at services that are provided by nonprofits and other agencies that could be specific to their agency, but that could also, if enhanced, take some ridership off of the public system at a much lower cost. So it does two things. It provides better service to the senior and disabled population, service that's more appropriate to their needs, while at the same time being a more efficient service by taking some of those trips off the very expensive ADA services. We're referring in this system, or in this document here, we describe the development of an accessible transportation plan that would be similar to what we use currently under Measure J for projects as a strategic plan. It would be a planning document that would look at specific projects, find the coordination. There would be certain requirements regarding coordination, breaking down some of the silos of the different operators, and then funding those projects based on criteria that will both help the senior and disabled population in meeting their transportation and mobility needs, as well as potentially saving taxpayer dollars in the long run by helping the public transit operators be more efficient in how they provide those services. So the idea would be this plan would be developed, and it would be kind of a programming document that would also establish policies. And in doing so, we could also, the idea of mobility management is they could look at different service delivery models to help deliver better service to seniors and people with disabilities.
And before we open up for comment, one of the requests from last meeting was, what do we fund for some of these categories currently out of Measure J? So Measure J dedicates a little bit over 6% of its funding to this category, which represents about 130 million. So the initial draft would augment that by about $50 million. And again, I don't know if Peter specifically said it, if we can apply mobility management to the funds that are in Measure J, it even makes them more efficient and effective.
Thanks, Ross. We do have one card, Elaine Welsh. I haven't put a limit on the comments now, but if you could keep it to 2 to 3 minutes or so, that would be great.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is my first EPAC meeting, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm getting excited as I'm hearing you all talk. As the CEO of Mobility Matters, we're the nonprofit agency that's rolling out mobility management projects right now in Contra Costa County. And I am thrilled to see a line item in the TEP draft that addresses dealing with senior and disability issues around mobility through the techniques of mobility management. We are honing those techniques as we speak with essentially no funding, and except what I'm able to produce with my master's in begging and advocacy as I go to different funding agencies to try to get money to do what we're doing. Unfortunately, the amount that's in there, and I'm not here to tell you or to make a suggestion what the amount should be, I feel is inadequate in that it continues to cover what is covered now with paratransit, but at the same time adds mobility management into it. And we're already seeing some early projects. We can do a lot to make things a lot more efficient and better for everybody. When we all leave here today, each of us is going to be at least 2 hours older than when we came. And I want you to keep that in mind when you're thinking about accessible transportation. The biggest myth we all have is that we're going to drive till the day we die. I can tell you as an old and an older geriatric rehab nurse, that rarely happens. We are living longer. My oldest client's 112, and he can't drive anymore. Please keep that in mind as you discuss the items today, this particular item today. The work you're doing on this TEP is going to help Contra Costa County become a great place to age. And I always laugh when we talk about seniors as them. It's all of us. Some of you are, if you're in your 20s today or you're 100 today, you're still going to be 2 hours older when you walk out of here. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I know this is hard, and I know cutting up a pie is never easy. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks very much.
And again, before we open the comment, if you look at your comment log, item 45, we attempted to get the comments that were raised at the last meeting by Debbie. So if there's anything you want to add, you can go first, and we'll open it up to the rest of the folks.
It's easier than lifting the 50-pound microphone. Sorry.
Exercise.
So I like the sight of Rita better. I submitted some comments this morning in writing, and I think the point that's being made in this particular category, first and foremost, the language is exactly what it needs to be. The policy platform is exactly what it needs to be. The frame from which you're looking at that is exactly where it needs to be. The funding, however, is inadequate to meet the policy that you've laid out in the language. I don't know if you make those comments public to everybody in the room, but I think it's important for this body to understand before they make recommendations to not fund it at a greater amount that, one, the existing Measure J funds paratransit. It does not fund door-through-door service. It does not fund volunteer driver programs. It does not fund technology. It does not fund mobility management or many of the things that need to take place to address this population. And everybody talks about the silver tsunami, but do you know what it looks like? The age group in Contra Costa County that is 75 and older is going to grow by 198% by the year 2060. The age group that is 85 and older is going to grow by 299%. Department of Finance numbers these are. The age group that's going to be working and riding BART and regular transit, the 25 to 64, the aging work group, is going to grow by 38% at that time. Just to give you that lens. This is not something we can put off until tomorrow. It's something that has to be addressed today, and it has to be addressed in a meaningful way. If we advocates and nonprofit providers are going to be able to leverage foundation funding and county resources, we need this measure to lay down the framework for the funding for the most basic elements of it. Thank you.
Thanks very much,
And
Debbie.
just as a point of comment, I guess we did get your comment on the supplemental log here, so
You
we'll
didn't get
add
all
that.
my numbers, you know.
Thank you. Other comments on this item, number 12?
Yes, I have one.
Please, Rita.
I spoke with a social worker at the Contra Costa County Regional Medical Center on transportation from West County to Martinez a few weeks ago, and she stated it's impossible as it takes 3 to 4 hours each way with an hour and a half waiting period in between someplace. As a result of that conversation, I was asked by Assemblymember Tony Thurman's staff to present that, to speak at a meeting of healthcare professionals, the person who was in charge of the hospital, Doctors Medical Center before it closed, and staff from Congressman Mark DeSaulnier's office, along with Tony Thurman's staff, and the Richmond city manager a couple of weeks ago at a special meeting that they had. They wanted to hear what I had to say, and that social worker, who was a staff member, had said about getting people, anybody who doesn't drive, from West County, especially West County Health Center, to Martinez for specialists and tests. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Nothing else on number 12? Oh, there's one comment back here.
This, I think, especially for paratransit, but also for other transit operations, it's really important to also think about funding these categories adequately so that the wages of the workers that do these jobs are high enough that we're a little bit beyond minimum wage. In a neighboring county, they put more into the paratransit category in their last measure, but wages for workers haven't increased, and they're having a really hard time in this economy getting quality drivers to carry some of our most precious cargo. We're dealing with people helping other people that are elderly, sick, with disabilities from place to place. So I think it's a sensitivity. It's really important. You want to pay enough so that you can trust the folks that you can hire. The most qualified people to do these jobs.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So I would just echo Debbie's comments about the silver tsunami, which is absolutely true, but it's not just that our population is aging overall, it's the medical needs that population will be having. They tend to have more complex medical conditions, they tend to be very frail, they are not individuals who can get on BART or buses. Really, I think that's an important point we need to add in.
Thank you. Okay, Ron.
Thank you for those of you who just shared some of the data and the information about what the need is going to be. And for myself, I'm not an expert in this area, but for this measure, which we've talked about at various times as needing and wanting it to be transformational, and given the fact that we already have a continuing expenditure plan, and this one is on top of, it's a new half cent. I think we ought to take the opportunity to really look at this kind of an issue as being one of the transformative things that we fund in anticipation of that growing population and of the kind of medical needs that are going to be emerging, and that we have the opportunity with this measure to really get in front of some of those issues, to catch up and then get in front of them so that we really can enhance the quality of life for the people who depend on public transportation and paratransit to get them to these kinds of services.
Thanks, Ron. Well, I thought there was a comment.
Yeah, just very quickly, I want to reiterate everything that has been said, especially the fact that we're all going to be seniors someday. Hopefully we won't all have to depend on paratransit, but for a lot of us, a great many of us, I imagine that we will. when I look at this funding category compared to the ferry intracity rail category and seeing that they're the same, it's a little disconcerting considering that we're not all going to end up taking the ferry someday. We're not all going to end up, depending on rail to get to work someday. But it's a little disconcerting to see that we've allocated the same amount of funding to both of those categories. It feels like this is one that is more universal and needs to be augmented, and certainly a whole lot more than what I would imagine would appeal to any future potential ferry riders.
Okay, Joel.
And I just want to make a kind of connection to a specific jurisdiction in East County, which is going to struggle with this problem. And it occurred to me how strong the link is between aging and land use, and how we create communities where people can access the services, can get from their home to downtown, from the home to the hospital. And this particular elected official in the Sound will be running his reelection campaign based on aging in place. And I think it's really important that we see that these communities that have often been sprawl-oriented and car-dependent can actually make a transformation towards something more like the kind of growth that we see in other places in this county, if they have the right infrastructure for people who are aging. So I think that likewise, it needs to be done in a thoughtful way where we can actually transition communities, not just moving people from place to place, but really encouraging the right kind of connections. So I think this is really important.
Thanks, Joel. If we could move on, we have a lot to go still. Okay. Next item.
All right, next item is 13, safe transportation for children. Very similar to a lot of the programs in Measure J. Measure J had about 4.5%, and about $97 million for this program. The types of uses have, and some of the existing types of uses and some that have been suggested to expand include school bus pass programs. There's very successful traffics programs in the San Ramon Valley and expanding that into La Miranda. So it's a variety of areas, a variety of ideas across the county, including could be safe routes to school projects. So it's a combination of tactics to get our children to and from school safely.
So EPAC comments on this item. Go right ahead.
Sure. This is Tim Leong, Contra Costa Community College District. I just wanted to reiterate my public comments that I submitted already, that community colleges are nowhere to be found in any of the recommendations for this particular tax measure. And while I don't want to necessarily move in on the K-12 systems on this particular item, but I do think that community college students have many of the same needs and issues as those identified in this particular point. And so I just wanted to reiterate the importance of making sure community colleges are included.
Thank you, Tim. Well,
I would second that, and I would also remind everyone that every day as our region grows, our county grows, the bus system gets more expensive to operate. With the more time that a bus sits in traffic, the more expensive it gets to pay that operator, to pay for the wear and tear on the vehicle, and to pay for the fuel costs. And it seems kind of silly to me that we're creating a program where theoretically, which I think we need, we would fund transit passes for youth for buses that might not even be there in the future because they've been priced out and effectively destroyed because we haven't taken care of them in the future. So while I support this, I also would really hope everyone thinks about the counter to this, which is if a transit pass is going to be of any use, whether you're a community college student or a high school or lower, you got to have a bus, and that bus needs to come frequently and reliably.
thank you. Well, any other comments on 13? Okay, let's.
14 is intercity rail ferry category. And this one was combined by staff and the consultant team. The input we got from the regional committees was really packaged separately, intercity rail improvements, primarily at Hercules, but there was some interest in making sure there's some funding available for our other stations. And then there's been a lot of work underway with the Water Emergency Transit Authority to reestablish ferry service in Contra Costa. That's going to happen beginning at Richmond. So this was funding to do some additional feasibility and potential pilot or implementation or permanent implementation of some of the potential ferry lines.
Okay, EPAC comments on number 14, intercity rail and ferries. Tim?
I just have a question. I'm just, my office is right outside of the Martinez station, and so I know how reliable it is and the number of riders that take advantage of that particular option. But I'm looking at the dollar amount of $50 million over the life of this potential tax, and I have no idea what that gets us. Is that just studies, or are we talking about actual construction of, that will fund actual construction of transit stops in some of these cities? So can you help me understand what 50 million gets you?
Yeah, I don't have the breakdown, but the largest chunk would be to try to help Hercules get a stop. Hercules is working to have a stop that would be both for the Capital Corridor and the San Joaquin lines. There's about 30 passenger trains that pass through there. A lot of it is construction. The bulk of it would be construction at the existing locations. And one of the thoughts behind the number is that in the cap and trade program that's continuing to grow at the state, one of the biggest programs, and I can't remember if it was 15 or 20%, I think it's 15% of the overall cap and trade dollars, is geared towards intercity rail, so trying to build linkages between cities, and then if high-speed rail makes it, to have good connections from high-speed rail to other, the rest of Northern California and the rest of Southern California. So we believe this one has a very large leveraging opportunity.
Well?
Yeah, and again, the connectivity here, the concern that I have is that we're not thinking long-term enough, and we're not thinking about how people would get to the ferry stations or to the rail stations, the future rail stations, because if we're just talking about, expecting people to drive there, then we need to be thinking about building parking lots and everything else and structures. And if we're going to be accommodating more cars, then we need to be thinking about widening freeways, which takes us full circle back to the mess that we're trying to get out of. So I would suggest that we be thinking more about how we get people to places like this and include something about connectivity, which might mean enhancing, whether it's innovative transit solutions or better bus service. Something needs to be done to make sure that we're also thinking big picture here, because otherwise we're just going to find ourselves having the same conversation in 50 years.
Okay, thank you. Other comment?
Another quick question, which is, so that there's different corridor studies, and I guess to Ross, the 80 corridor study, is that distinct in a way from rail solutions that would have to be funded in a different category?
Not sure I understand your question, but the 80 corridor study is including both the potential for BART rail or enhancing or even potentially different lines for the Capital Corridor. So
I think that answers my question. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there's duplicity here, duplication here, and how that would be corrected. Say a lot of the other categories, I know we want more specificity. At the same time, it'd be good to know if things weren't going one way, in what way would those funds be spent if they weren't being used on something else? So
there's one comment I think is consensus is there's not enough money in any category. So maybe you can write that down for me.
Okay. Let's move on then to pedestrian, bicycle, and trail facilities, number 15.
Okay, this is pretty much mirrors what's in Measure J, and Measure J funded bike and ped trails at about, I have my cheat sheet here somewhere, at about 1.5 million, about 33, or 1.5%, about 33 million. Thank you, Sham. So this is really geared towards connecting our the major trail systems throughout the county. So this would augment that funding by about twice as much.
Okay.
And
comments?
I'll just say 2/3 of it would really go towards constructing new trails, and then 1/3 of it goes to the park district for maintenance of existing trails.
So EPAC member comments? Yeah.
Yeah, Sean Dugan, East Bay Regional Parks. First of all, I want to just say that I appreciate the current Measure J investment into trails, and I think everyone benefits from that in the county, as well as the 1/3 for maintenance of roughly about 100 miles of trail that we take care of in the county. There's about 100 more proposed, and many of these are approaching 30 years old and they need work. So this investment, I'll share with you some information of why I think it's working from a transportation perspective. The first thing I did when I saw this new transportation expenditure plan was I compared it to the previous straw man that was thrown in front of us. And forgive me if I don't share the high point comment that was mentioned earlier. Obviously, this is doubling what is currently in the Measure J, which we support. But when you look at all the investments as a whole, you look at $300 million for BART access and parking improvements. You look at major streets and complete streets investments. If we don't look proportionately at how bicyclists and pedestrians are making that last mile to those locations, we're missing a key part of the picture. And I know we're not missing it because you are investing some in, but I don't think it's doing it justice. I do think it needs to go up. And the reason, back to the aging population, we're focusing on all these things we think are going to solve getting people out of their cars. If we're asking people to go take more transit and we're increasing transit capacity, we can't ask them to get in their car and drive to transit. Because once you're in your car, you all know it's feel pretty nice in your car. You're going to keep driving. So if we could get them to that without ever having to set foot in their car, that's what we're for. And I'll just share with you real quick, I'll keep it short. We operate about 20 automatic counters in Contra Costa County, and they're on the Iron Horse Trail, the Contra Costa Canal Trail, the Delta de Anza Trail, and the San Francisco Bay Trail, and others. Those 20 automatic counters have shown between 2011 and 2015 a 39% increase in trail usage. That averages out to about 2 million users per year. That's a healthy amount of people, and I think that when you look at the peak hours that these trails are being used, over half of them show a peak between 7 and 9 in the morning and 4 and 7 in the evening, which mirrors the freeways, it mirrors the BART peaks. People are commuting on our trails, and I think that this is a key part of the picture. And I guess I'll just leave it at that, the more proportionately we look at this, I'm not asking for 10%. I don't think, I realize that money has to come from another category in order to raise another category, and there's a lot of competing interests here. But I think that if we don't invest proportionately in this non-motorized transportation element in the county, that we're going to find ourselves here when people have no other choice. We're going to have a lot of lanes on freeways. We're going to have full BART cars. People need to move around without motorized transportation.
Thank you very much, Sean. Other comments? Go right ahead.
Dave Campbell, Advocacy Director with Bike East Bay. Want to ask that this get bumped up to 5%, I think is the absolute minimum. In 2000, when Alameda County reauthorized their sales tax measure, they brought their bike ped funding from about 1 to 2% in the late 1980s to 5%. That was 16 years ago. They brought up their funding to 5%. 2 years ago, 2014, they reauthorized and bumped that up to around 12%. San Francisco's is at around 10%. Marin County is at around 15%. And if you look at the numbers of people who are biking to work You can see the results of those in San Francisco County. You can see the results of those in Alameda County. And boy, can you see the results of those in Contra Costa County. If you can picture two divergent lines on a graph, one going up and one going down, you can guess which one is Contra Costa County. It's a direct reflection of our funding levels here. And 2.6%, doubling from 1.5%, doesn't get it done. The need is huge. And I do want to thank staff and everyone for supporting our ask for complete streets. That's hugely important. But even with $200 million for complete streets, we may get 10, 15 solid projects out of that in a county with 17 cities and 20-something towns. That touches a low percentage of the overall number of roads. It touches the important ones, but not nearly all of them. That's why the bike ped funding category is so important, and why it's used directly to simply stripe a bike lane, put a sidewalk in. The very basic stuff we should have been doing more of 20 years ago, and we're playing catch up to do now. I think we can easily get that up to 5%. There's some other categories here. I just walked in. I don't know if we're starting to use our arrows for up and down.
No,
to
we're
spend
gonna get
things,
to
but
that.
got plenty of ideas there. But the ask here is 5% for the bike ped category.
Okay, thank you. We're running about 20 minutes, 15 minutes behind, so we're just trying to push these comments a little bit. You'll get another chance, or other chances. Okay, moving on then to, are we on 16?
The Community Incentive Development Program is a program that didn't exist in Measure J, so we can't compare it to that. At this point in time, I'm just going to try to talk a little bit, not so much about the words that you read here, but the intent of what we're trying to do. A lot of discussion in one of our other small groups here on this topic, so if anyone from that involved there wants to speak, please do so. Again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the real common themes here is that we need to be planning our development in a manner that makes our transportation system more effective. So that's really the main purpose of what we're trying to do here, is to develop our growth in areas that take advantage of our existing system and don't put any additional or minimizes the additional burden on our system as our population grows. So the words you read in here will be significantly changed when we come out of the process, so I'd like to just leave it at that, and then if anyone involved wants to make a comment, please do so, and then we'll move on.
Any other comments on CDI?
I think Mike wants to say something.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, I would just remind folks.
Hold that mic up close if you can. You need to hold the mic up close. Thanks.
Yeah,
It's on.
Okay.
You have to speak real close to the mic.
How's this?
Perfect.
Wow, that was a weak microphone. I was at a school board meeting last night, and they had the world's most powerful microphone. I had to hold it like all the way out from my arm. Kind of like when I'm trying to read something. I just remind folks that this program was proposed by city managers as an alternative to an idea that I think may have been discussed at EPAC, certainly was discussed in small group conversations, that a portion of return to source be conditioned upon production of housing. So I think there's a great deal of interest in seeing more housing production, especially more infill housing production, and having that encouraged by this measure. I think there's still a degree, I'd say a fair or substantial degree of concern among some of us that this proposed.
You want to try it again?
That this proposed program may well not accomplish what we would like it to accomplish, and there is still some active thinking among a number of the EPAC members to try to make the original idea work better. So, just I guess I would offer the observation to my colleagues here on the EPAC. Keep your minds open, and I'd offer a comment to staff that this is not a closed conversation. a conclusion as far as a lot of us are concerned.
Thanks, Mike. Apologies on the audio system there. Others on the community development incentive? Okay, number 17.
All right, number 17 is a new program being proposed. This is kind of encapsulates a number of things, including some where CCTA is taking a leadership role. So the idea is that there's really three purposes outlined here, A, B, and C. A would be to provide some funding for demonstration projects to prove technology and innovation. B would be projects, or not projects, but activities specifically geared at greenhouse gas emissions. So, a lot of things that you do could have greenhouse gas emission reduction as an outcome. This would be funding things like charging stations or inductive charging or other things like that that are really the primary outcome is GHG reduction. And then C is really an emerging thought that's really taken hold across the country. I didn't put the term smart city in here, but if you're following this, there's a term out there called smart city where you're really connecting your communities, and since transportation is ubiquitous, part of it really revolves around transportation. A lot of investigation of a shared economy where you'd have the car ownership may be a thing of the past, and people would have access to pools of cars or other vehicles to get around. And the thought of smart city is to try to use technology to better integrate all services. So this really encapsulates a lot beyond transportation. So again, A is, I don't want to call it R&D, but it's to really demonstration projects to deploy emerging technology, something we've been able to do with a few jurisdictions around the county. And one thing I'll just say about that, it's very difficult to get a transportation engineer, for example, to put some technology on the streets, and it's impossible if they have to pay for it. So this helps people say yes to trying some innovation. So comments?
Okay, please, go ahead.
Some of this stuff sounds great. I'm following CCTA on Twitter and various staff, so I see that you're out there pushing all sorts of innovation. I just question whether a half-cent sales tax is the place to fund this kind of experimental stuff, or are there other federal or state sources that might be a better place to go for funding for these kind of sexy innovations, or self-driving cars, or other stuff that I imagine would be something that would be up for consideration for this category. Given that we're struggling to find money for bike paths, for trails, for transit operations, to really move people around, I think this is a category that may be too high compared to other ones.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Just to add to that, to Cheryl's comment, that I wonder too how competitive CCTA would be with the private market on these technologies. It seems like no matter what investment cities can put into it, there's always going to be a private company that out-competes.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say, as we get down to the funding numbers, I think the concept here needs to be part of the measure, but I don't think we need a separate category for this. The technology should be baked into all the other projects and programs and not be set aside separately as some future project, unless you have a specific project in mind and then put it in here. But if we don't know what it is, I think this concept needs to be distributed through everything, and the category needs to be eliminated. And I say that mostly because it's now a fight for money, not for good ideas.
Thank you. Well,
Can I just add something?
oh yeah, go ahead.
So as someone who's intimately engaged with the new technology, we're just buying some of these driverless buses for Bishop Branch. This is the wave of the future. There are going to be programs that will be private programs, such as ours. We're lucky that we have a critical mass that can afford to do it. There will be public programs like the county, and there'll be programs that will be in between to try and serve this. This is the wave of the future. There are a lot of things that we're funding that will become redundant by virtue of technology, and I just want to urge everyone that we ought to have the flexibility in all of our expenditures to adopt technology as it becomes available to make all of our objectives more achievable.
Thank you. Well, and then over here.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what's been said, most of what's been said. The concern that I would add that I feel is missing after having just campaigned effectively to win the the bond measure in San Francisco, where I was going from community center to community center looking for endorsements. This is the kind of thing that people attacked us for. It's what they call squishy funding, where the taxpayer wants to know where their dollar is going to be used, and if it's not laid out, it's going to be hard to defend and hard to get people to buy into what they're effectively going to be paying for. If we're going to try to fund driverless automated buses for wherever, it should be called out and named so that people know what they're going to be voting for. I feel like ultimately this category is important. It might be baked into something else, but I think it's ridiculous to deny that the future isn't coming. But I just think that we need to be very considerate about how we're asking for public support and where we're baking it in.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joel. Go ahead.
Peter Leiden at Transdev. I'd like to say a word in support of this line item. There is, in fact, a transportation revolution going on, or there are technological revolutions of several characters going on, and among other things, they will permit real forward progress on greenhouse gases. That's a reference to electrification. But they'll also permit real advances on the cost of transportation. I'm referring now to the new forms of sharing transportation resources. You have in the county a professional transportation staff which is alert and which is comfortable on the forward edge. And if you give this staff the resources to stay on the forward edge of this revolution, including testing and experimental things, the potential for gains to the county are very, very large. You're likely to have here very good, well-invested money.
Thank you very much. Other questions on this technology and transportation?
Just quick thought. I think Joel raises a good point about voters wanting to know what they're getting and this being a little bit difficult to wrap your hands around. The flip side of that is, I think it's difficult to say what we want to buy with it and wrap your hands around it because the technology is changing so fast. So I don't know how to reconcile that. But I don't know, this probably is not something that needs to be specified in the measure, but because the technology is changing so fast and at a geometric rate, I think it's important that the authority not spend all this money up front, right? What we can buy today is going to be nothing like what you can buy 5, 10, 15 years from now. There's a place to seed some opportunity now, but at the same time recognize that the opportunities are going to be 10, 20, 100 times greater 10 or 15 years from now.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, moving on to 18, transportation planning.
Yeah, 18 and 19, 18 and 20 kind of do that together. So 18 is planning, transportation planning, facility and services. This was in Measure J at 3%. So as I think we all know, the need to do smart planning is increasing, so that's providing a little bit of additional funding for that, and then 20 is administration. So these are really the two categories that allow CCTA to fulfill its role in administering the sales tax measure.
Any comments on this category or these categories? Yes, Tim?
As noted in my comments, what's always interesting to me and as a newbie to transportation conversation, that there's some wonderful ideas and very smart people that are in this room making the decision. I think that perhaps this is wearing my education hat. I think we really need to have some thoughtful conversations about how is it that we are educating the rest of our county in the things that we are talking about and the things that we are trying to achieve. I believe that we in this room aren't going to be the ones that are going to be able to make the changes to see the ultimate goals of the things that we're talking about, that we will need our county, our residents, our voters to understand, embrace, and to also contribute to these goals. And as I stated in my comments, maybe part of that is this concerted and ongoing education plan, more than just putting up a sign saying funded by CCTA, measure blah, blah, blah. It's got to be something more than that so that we can get others in this county to appreciate the thoughtful conversations and thinking that went into this, and why is it that it deserves the kinds of the investment that we are asking them to make.
Thank you, Tim. Any other EPAC comments? Okay, we're almost there.
And I think we chatted about this at the last meeting, the category 19 regional choice. This is really not a category. This is just a target for each of the regional committees to adjust funding or to request that we adjust funding higher or lower from a countywide number. So I described that a little bit when I was trying to respond to Kenji's comment. So I don't know if there's a real need to discuss that. That one will disappear. So let's just moving on very quickly. We're still going to try to save some time for exercise. The growth management program that was included in this version is largely, well, not is largely, it is the existing Measure J growth management program. There's been some comments to acknowledge some of the discussion that's occurred here and in some other venues. So this is being modified, and we hope that we have are able to share it with some of the key folks next week. So I would, unless you have some real burning comments on that, I would like to move on with that. And I'll, as we do that, I'll include the attachment A, the principles of agreement for establishing an urban limit line. There's been a lot of good thought put into that, and some investigation of what this really means, and some potential compromise positions that would be discussed among stakeholders and with our authority board in March. So with the understanding that there's still work to do on these, I'd like to just open it up for some very general comments. But if it's comments that have already been included in here, note that we have that and we're working on that.
Yeah, Ron?
I think it was at the last EPAC meeting I expressed some concern that the language that was in the TEP is from Measure J and that it didn't reflect anything new. And at that point, we were working to establish the voter-approved urban limit lines, and so much has changed as a result of that. I am aware that some of the conversations have occurred around some alternatives for the urban limit line that I think are possibly encouraging, but they are not the only elements of a growth management program that we need to look at, and I understand that there is some conversation taking place, but that I would hope that very quickly we have some things to look at that are going to address a little bit more about the regional mitigation program, advanced mitigation program, as well as ag mitigation, and some of the just other policies and criteria related to return to source that help to create a viable growth management program.
Thank you. You know, I have one card, although the agenda item has not been written here, from Wayne Rasmussen. Is he here? Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Wayne Rasmussen from Rasmussen Planning in San Ramon, and I'm representing Dr. James Delano from the Bishop Ranch Veterinary Clinic. And the clinic is located at the southeastern corner of I-680 and Norris Canyon Road. And I just had a quick question with regard to the on-ramps, or the ramps, elevated ramps project at that interchange, and to ask if that is included in the draft as it's going forward now.
Norris Canyon is not specifically named in here, but there's about 140 million, is that the right number, that has been proposed for a 680 corridor to improve transit, and 140 million to improve transit and traffic flow on 680.
So then how does that, going forward, does that relate to this measure then, or is that independent?
I'm not sure I understand your comment.
As far as funding for that project, I'm trying to find out if the project is planned to go forward through implementation of the draft.
Well, I think the answer is that this draft TEP does not include funds, specific funding for that project. It's got general funds for the 680 corridor, but it's oversubscribed as it is, so there's really not a, we're not down to the very specific projects, but it's going from basically Dublin to Martinez in terms of the 680 corridor, so there is no money specifically designated. And as an example of the other, 684 interchange up in North Part is specifically called out, so the fact that it's not called out, I think, is the answer.
Okay, thank you. And if I could just, for the record, indicate that Dr. Delano would oppose the addition of that project to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Comment. Any other comments?
Catherine had a...
Yeah, sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Catherine Ledan from the Brentwood Agricultural Land Trust, and I apologize I wasn't here last time. I understand that there are separate conversations going on between these meetings, particularly about the growth management plan. I haven't been included in those, and frankly, as an aside, it leaves me a little confused about what I'm doing here today if things are being worked out in a separate forum. But I have two comments. First is, as I said, I wasn't here last time, and I apologize, but I noticed that the regional advanced mitigation, I believe it's 11 perhaps, now includes only habitat and doesn't require the mitigation for the loss of productive agricultural land. In other words, the land where we grow our food. And I also, when I last checked in, one of the things that was on the table is that the growth management plan would require that jurisdictions not only approve an urban limit line, but also approve both open space and agricultural mitigation programs. And I don't see that included as well. So if someone could tell me what happened to those concepts, I'd appreciate it.
I'll try to be brief. So the advanced mitigation program, as common as we're just getting off the ground, the intent is to do advanced mitigation for the projects that are funded through this program. And I believe that when you see the revision to the next version of the growth management program, that you will see the requirement for or at least staff and consultants' recommendation of the requirement for ag mitigation for the loss of any productive land.
Okay, and in the growth management plan?
In the growth management program, yes.
Okay, so then the drafts that we're looking at don't incorporate the most recent negotiation? Okay.
The draft that you're looking at is the Measure J Growth Management Program with some comments. And I believe one of the comments is related to ag somewhere. So yes, ag is being addressed. And no one is seeing the results of the most recent discussions, because those have occurred at about 11 o'clock this morning. So we're talking all the time to all kinds of people, and there's no way to bring everything that's happening to this meeting. So it will be addressed.
Okay, this is a very confusing process to be engaged in because I'm not getting
Write that down.
current information.
That's an understatement.
That's an understatement. Thank you for your comments. Yeah. One over here.
Yeah, a comment on item 8. I apologize if you'll indulge me to go back. And it's also on the Complete Streets policy as well. This is the 680 Route 4 interchange. The freeway here is a huge gap between Pleasant Hill and Concord, and we want to try to identify a way to get a bike ped crossing somewhere within this 20-mile stretch that you can get safely between two cities there. And we've started to capture it here with the last sentence that talks about designing this project with alternatives to the single occupant vehicle in mind. So the comment is that the Complete Streets policy that we're working on that governs all the money, this is a great example of how it can govern a better design for an interchange project, where the freeway of the interchange is an absolute barrier to bicycling between Pleasant Hill and Concord.
Thank you. Joel, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to Ron and Catherine's comments on agriculture, which is it does need a little bit more airing, particularly at the stakeholder groups with individual meetings and with the commissioners. And it's really important that we figure out the connection between the Regional Advanced Mitigation Program and what local jurisdictions do and the county does, because if we don't have something that makes sure that agriculture is mitigated, it will just apply to state and federal law, and that's not adequate. So there are many things, and I hope you work with stakeholders to clarify those issues.
Indeed. Yes?
So, for the growth management program, on goals and objectives, I think we need to more strongly address equity within this. I think geographical equity is being addressed, but not equity between different communities, between income levels, between the communities where moderate and low-income working families live versus the more affluent communities within the county. We all know that there's an affordable housing crisis in the Bay Area, and I think we need to take a strong look at this policy to ensure that we're not forcing people that we need to work in the Bay Area out of making Contra Costa County out of reach for them. There's a whole ripple effect of problems with that. So I just want to throughout, I should go back through the project and program areas with an equity lens. But I think we can't forget that. It's a huge, wealth or income inequality. It's a huge issue, and all of our policies need to be looking at how do we not exacerbate that problem.
Thank you. Okay.
Trying to complete our review here. Complete Streets policy, this is what you read in here will be revised. David and others are working to have a policy, and all I would ask is that, Dave, you say it's heading in the right direction and we move on?
Yeah, absolutely, and I just want to thank staff for working so closely with us on this important policy. I think we're making good progress.
Regional Advanced Mitigation Program, there's a lot behind this. This is language that's almost word for word from the Sandag measure that passed in 2004, and a number of folks around the table will be involved in fleshing out this program. The reason that there are no funding amounts in here, that is an amount. That is an exercise that we need to go through. I just share that we have consultant resources on board that can help us with that. Folks from ICF. That is a commitment to flesh this out more. Are there any burning comments on that program?
Just that Sandag's percentage allocated for their regional mitigation program ought to be taken a look at as we're looking at this, and you also used as a guideline for what percentage, as we set as a minimum amount to go to this project, or to this program.
Thanks, Ron.
Governing structure and implementing guidelines. We could spend several meetings on these topics. I think the highlights that I'd like to just show out, the governing body administration, that's our existing structure. We have an existing citizens advisory committee, this citizens oversight committee, which will likely be renamed to public oversight committee based on comments we've received already, is intended to change that, to really replace that existing committee and to really empower it to be the watchdog over both fiscal audits and performance audits. The advisory committees, that remains largely unchanged from what's in our current structure. Implementing guidelines, I think that some of the real highlights of that, again, we have the Citizens Oversight Committee as a commitment, fiscal and performance audits. Maintenance of effort means that jurisdictions or any entity that receives funding is prohibited from redirecting funding and that transportation funding that they currently use into non-transportation purposes, meaning that you end up with no net gain. This is to be a net gain, not to replace other funds. Let's see, all projects obviously are required to meet applicable laws in CEQA. We're trying to embed in here a lot of periodic performance reviews. So I know there's a lot of definition needed on those. So we're proposing that any project in excess of 25 million has a performance review. And then somewhere in here, well, I guess it's 8, the performance audits. We're proposing that a quarter of the programs get audited every year from a performance standpoint, and that audit be really administered by the Citizens Oversight Committee. Those are the highlights that I can see here. So any comments on that? And we're trying to rush to get into our next item. So if you have any comments, continue to email those in, and we'll continue to build our comment log and address the comments.
Thanks a lot, Ross.
Peter has a comment.
Peter.
Hi. Skipping back to Cheryl Brown's comment on the element of equity and not devising solutions that are expensive and therefore tend to exclude people, I'd like to give that a strong second.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Okay, moving on to our next item here. The members of the EPAC received a form to try to get a sense of priorities about these categories. It's hard to go into a lot of detail right now, but we would like to ask you to fill that out if you haven't filled it out. We're going to take a break for about just 5 minutes or so, and we'll try to be back. Okay, for what we're trying to gather here is some Vince's thoughts about the priorities of these different categories. This is not meant to be a be-all or end-all. It's another data point for us to understand the relationship between the priorities for the various categories. And what we've asked the EPAC to do is just indicate from the list of funding categories and policies what's the most important ones, and with a 1 to 5 rating, and then indicate the categories that deserve greater funding or deserve deserve less funding. So for those of you who in the EPAC who have already filled out your form and are complete and turned it in, we'd just like to get a brief, and actually maybe before we do this, I'd like to ask the permission of the EPAC that we take an extra 15 minutes if people can. I've been informed that the room doesn't need to be evacuated immediately after this, our meeting, so we can, if we can buy 15 minutes or so, would that be okay? Can I just see nodding heads? Generally speaking, good. Thank you. So what we'd like to ask each of the EPAC members to do is just briefly, in 2 minutes or so, more or less, highlight what you prioritized and why you prioritized that. Why was that particular item important to you? So since there's still a couple of people, well, maybe we can just start with Mike. Why don't you go ahead? And we're going to go around the circle here.
I did my document this morning. I don't have it with me, but off the top of my head, I think that the theme that was driving my comments was the sense that I think I conveyed at the very first meeting of this group, that what matters to my members, Bay Area Council, major employers, is number one, commute improvement that supports employment. Number two, BART. Number three, technology. And I observed in the distribution that about 39% of the money is allocated to categories that address regional or cross-county transportation, and then the remainder is obviously a little bit inaccurate, but it's an approximation. Then the remainder, I think, approximately addresses local and community transportation. So the comment that I conveyed on behalf of our members was that we'd like to see more of a 50-50 split, recognizing that, again, oversimplifying, but the cross-county and regional transportation is what really supports the driving employment factors of our economy. And the local and community-based transportation supports the quality of our communities, the livability, environmental features, and the production of housing. And we need to focus on both, but we need to focus on them equally. So some of the areas that I highlighted that could be increased to bring a balance between the longer distance and the community transportation are the three corridors, and I think I put the East County corridor as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, could you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't hear your two.
The corridor part?
There's a line item, there's three line items, one each for 680, 80, and 24/4. And in each case, they're not proposing, of course, adding lanes or highway improvements. We're proposing largely a transit-based quality transit solution in the corridor.
Okay, thanks. Mike, that's kind of a perfect synthesis of your important and priority. So I'm not saying it substantively. I'm just saying for the rest of the folks who comment, that's the level at which we're looking for our comments, if you would. It's a hard act to follow. Rita.
I gave it to Ben.
I'm concerned about the connectivity between transit systems. I think it's very important because of the difficulty in reaching various parts of the county. This could be taken the wrong way. The lack of coordination between paratransit and senior transit agencies, like city-based agencies, because of the geographical boundaries. I'd like to see much more frequency in bus service and better coverage of service areas. And then complete streets is very important because it makes cities more walkable, reduces single occupancy vehicle trips, and of course reduces greenhouse gas I also said, I think, I don't really know money, but to me, it seems like it's too large of a percentage of funds for local street maintenance, which I marked on there. Maybe distribute some of it to some of the other categories. That's basically it.
Great, thank you. And Rita, if you could hand that off so we can tabulate that up, that would be great. And Cheryl, or I'm sorry, Debbie.
You already know mine, so skip me. I think, obviously, I want to see more funding for accessible transportation, but I think my lens in this overall process, considering the perspective of the taxpayer and what people who live in Contra Costa want, which is to live in a happy and healthy environment. And I think that that includes doing things more wisely for future generations, not just how we take care of our seniors who are going to be aging, but how we plant the seeds for a beautiful place for our children to grow up. And I think we do that through alternate methods of transportation. I also think that from a social justice lens, if you look at everybody paying the same amount in sales tax to the lower income populations, it's a lot greater percentage of their income. And how can we make their buck more effective for them? And so that's sort of the way that I prioritize my categories.
Thank you. Cheryl.
I have an initial take, and I'll hand in the paperwork afterwards. But for the Central Labor Council, we really can't approach transit without thinking about housing and jobs. And so, in what I'm going to prioritize, I'm balancing the needs of workers and their families, including their kids and including workers when they retire, with the need for good jobs and access to jobs in the county. So I think I'm going to just say we're prioritizing in this measure right now the funding of bus operations, which is now called non-rail transit. Because that's what addresses most of our challenges. And regarding technology, we need to make sure that technology isn't leaving people out, that technology isn't coming up with solutions that aren't affordable to the working people, students, and the elderly in this county.
Thank you. Rebecca?
So my thoughts basically was I think for the hospitals, we are both obviously a provider of medical services, and we need to have transportation that allows people to get to hospitals and doctors' offices and other medical facilities who don't have cars. But we're also major employers, so we have lots of employees, and we like to be able to get them around the county, and they do a lot of commuting on all the freeways. So we're kind of looking for a balance between the building and improving roads and how we move people, and looking for a little more equity in both of those overall numbers. Because of our patient population in hospitals, which is older, sicker, frail, the accessible transportation is key for us, so that's where we would advocate for additional funding. And in terms of new technology, I don't remember who said it around this table about kind of baking it into the programs that we want to fund out of this. I think that's probably a really good idea. I like it. That if they're going to get funding under this measure, that they consider how they do it in an innovative way.
Okay, great. Next.
So, representing an agricultural land trust and agricultural conservationists in Contra Costa County, I think that what the Brentwood Agricultural Land Trust would be looking for is to emphasize transportation improvements that support, that are located and that support development that protects both our natural and our agricultural resources. So, in other words, there are bedroom communities in Contra Costa County that are sprawling out on agricultural land, And I think increasing the job housing balance in those places is important. Agriculture is a major contributor to Contra Costa's economy, and so we also want to ensure that there is goods management that facilitates agricultural enterprise, and particularly the distribution of food in our own communities and in our own region. And so I think that's about it.
Great, thank you very much.
During this whole process, I felt, I felt somewhat bridled by the fact that I agree with everything that everyone has said in this room on every meeting I've been to. But I keep coming back to the same thing, which is that I can't shake my myopic affliction that this is a transportation issue bond. And I know many things can have a part, and I'm sure they do in transportation. I still focus on just 4 major items. After giving it some thoughtful consideration, I think that the 680 expenditure is far too low. I think it needs to be something more like 200 or 220 million, and that's based on the informed opinions of others I've had conversations with. The East County BART extension, I think, is a terrific idea. I know that I would hate to have the funds lost in ancillary BART issues. I think we like to have it focus on infrastructure and maintenance. To continue on another BART expenditure item, it comes to my attention that it's again for infrastructure, but the infrastructure certainly could include cars, and I understand there's another BART issue. So if there's a replacement of funds for cars, I would like to see that on a one-to-one basis. And my last comment is that as Cheryl mentioned, non-rail transit enhancements seemed like it was a bit of a catch-all, and I'm glad that she thinks that is focusing on bus transport, because I think that's probably most of it. But I'm wondering if this document is going to be used to engage with the public, and I wonder if we could make it clearer to the public, as it was not for me until a few moments ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Tim?
So my swipe at this was based on a couple of things. I think that there's a number of categories here that are clearly important, but at the end of the day, when you only have X amount of money, something's got to give and you got to prioritize. So I'll take it. I'll share my comments in this way, looking at both the current allocation or draft allocation. If those numbers changed, my priorities could also change, but I do think local streets maintenance improvements is a top priority. I do think that voters want to know or have shared with us enough of their comments that they're tired of rolling over potholes and other challenges on the roads, and I think that if we're going to be successful in passing this, that we better appease the voters, at least at the local level, that some of this is going to help the streets that they drive on every day. I also indicated on that particular item that the current allocation, given all the other priorities, are a little high, may deserve less funding, even though you could probably spend all the money we have on this category. I also thought BART capacity, at least from what I've learned thus far, deserves less funding, not because you couldn't spend the money, but I just sometimes think BART is so big that you can gobble up, or you can take all the money and you can make a case for spending all of our money, and I just think that there's way too many issues for us to try to address. And same thing goes with the BART East Contra Costa Transit Extension. or is it, no, that's not BART, that's, well, I identified that as an area that deserved less funding. The categories that I thought were a priority, I think were just, along with what Bob was saying, focusing on the transportation corridors. So given the amount of money that was allocated, at least in this draft, I thought that all 4 of them were worthy of prioritizing. And that the 4 areas that I thought deserved more funding were non-rail transit enhancements, and in particular I was thinking about the bus service and how we do need to make that much more reliable, much more consistent. Transportation for seniors and people with disabilities, because I am of that age, so I am being selfish. Safe transportation for children, and I'll just add to that students, because I do think that community college students need to be a part of that conversation, and pedestrian bicycles and trail facilities.
Thanks very much, Tim.
Kristen and I have discussed 2 main principles to consider these priorities. First being improving the mobility of goods and people, especially along commute corridors. The second is designing a TEP that is most likely to resonate with the voters and therefore maximize the chances it will actually pass in November. With those in mind, priorities in order of preference. 1 is the 680 corridor, 2, East County corridor, 3, State Route 4 and 242, 4 is the I-80 corridor, and 5 is the BART capacity access and parking improvements. 4 categories we marked down as where we could pull back some funding, return to source, local streets and maintenance, non-rail transit enhancements, pedestrian, bicycle, and trail facilities, and the regional choice category.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for the homework. So as a representative of the East Bay Regional Park District, of course, my top priorities on this list are non-motorized transportation, bicycle and pedestrian trail facilities, the Regional Advanced Mitigation Program, and safe transportation for children, as well as transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. And I will say that from a representative on this committee that has an education and planning with an emphasis on transportation, that I see the current TEP in front of me just slightly out of balance. I think that things could be moved around that could balance this expenditure plan and also be transformative with an emphasis towards non-motorized transportation in my book. So I'll just add that we have $129 million worth of transportation projects that are just trail projects in this brochure that I've left out on the table there. And currently right now this measure is, the TEP here would fund half of those. So that's my piece. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I haven't given you project by project preferences or dispreferences, but I would like to make the broad comment that the exercise so far is not showing evidence of a major conceptual attack on vehicle miles traveled, that's to say auto congestion, and greenhouse gas emission, which are a crisis of our period in history. My own feeling is that a major conceptual attack on these problems will revolve around the concept of transit-oriented development and integration of transportation and land use planning. And in that case, the function of the CCTA is fundamental, innovating, front edge contribution has got to be support from the transportation sector for the priority development areas. And for their intensification in the sense that within PDAs, people will be able to walk and bike rather than have to drive to major transit. My own feeling is that coming back to the decision which overarches all of these, which is whether CCTA should go forward now with the TEP and with a proposal for additional tax revenue, I would say the county and CCTA is not ready. The problem which has been highlighted of the order of doing a county transportation plan on the one hand and a TEP on the other, which is raised in particular by the Sierra Club, I think is a good point. At this point, we're trying to operate with the cart before the horse. We're trying to operate out of the logical order of solving these problems. And the thought was that in order not to waste 2 years or 4 years, it could be done. Frankly, I think it probably cannot be done. And that you need to deal with these issues at a county transportation level, and then after that, see what the cost implications are and think about going for additional tax revenue to do them.
Thank you very much. Ken?
First, I want to respond to Mike's comment. Sorry he left. But by my math, I'm seeing slightly more than 50% of the money going to regional trips than local trips. That was my quick math. So before taking Mike's comments to heart too much, check his math. Then the two categories obviously most important to Bike East Bay and to our members are the Major Streets Complete Streets program and the Bike Ped funding. They both need to be increased. Those are the things that are going to get our members excited and get them ready to get out on the campaign trail and get this message to the voters so they'll vote yes, and we'll get more money for much needed transportation improvements in Contra Costa County.
Thank you. Well,
in addition to that,
I'm sorry.
We support more funding for BART, or I should say I like the funding for BART that you've put in here. More money for the bus services, and support the funding in the Community Development Investment Grant Program. Keep that solid. The one area I would look at for making adjustments downward, one, I think the local streets is the big elephant in the room that we can look at moving some money around. But also, I see 3 corridor transit projects in East County that add up to about $257 million. Comparing that with the 80 corridor, which gets $110 million, and the 680 corridor, which gets $140 million, which probably needs more money. Could we move some money from these 3 East County projects that are very similar in scope and intent and goals to either of the other 2 corridor projects or to other projects that need more funding?
Okay. Thanks.
Great. So I think just 3 very quick thoughts. I already conveyed my frustration earlier about the lack of transit operations. I think if we're going to start talking about building, mass transit capacity enhancements along the 680 corridor to the 80 corridor, we've got to think about how people are going to get to that. And if we can build it right now, like let's imagine a BRT corridor on the 680, where did the operations funding come from to fund something like that? I would imagine that if we don't have a source programmed for it by way of creating a new revenue stream for transit operations, it would effectively go towards taking money away from the already starved transit operations that are in existence right now to operate a high capacity mass transit thing, whatever it might be. So we can't just be thinking about capital, we need to be thinking about operations. That goes for all BART stations. We are at capacity with respect to parking. We can't build any more parking lots at our BART stations. It's a poor use of land, and if we're going to expect more people to get on BART, once we have new BART cars in a good state of good repair, we need people to be able to get to BART, and that's going to come through transit, but better bus service. With respect to the BART system itself, I think that while I grew up advocating for the Bay Point BART station, I know how exciting and important extensions are. I also know too well that BART is at capacity and is busting at the seams, and I can't at this point imagine how, without new cars and a stable system, that we can accommodate more people, that we would extend BART out towards. And I know that they need hundreds of millions of dollars for their cars alone. So I would really emphasize funding BART cars and figuring out how we can expand transit access to the existing system that we have without just extending out more east and then expecting people to just drive to that in the future. I think that we need to be more clear about innovation. I am supportive and I love the idea of innovation, but it needs to be equitable, needs to be done with an accessibility of equity in mind, meaning everybody needs to be able to use it, not just the banked and those that are tech savvy. We need to make sure that we spell it out, because to me, innovation means better parking management or high occupancy toll express lanes. I don't see too much of any of that in this document. I don't see anything about high occupancy toll express lanes as a way to address traffic congestion on our freeways, which could then create another source of revenue for transit and getting to transit. And then lastly, I really want to emphasize a struggle that we're having with seeing transit investments or basically public investments anywhere are beginning to be met with opposition because there is not enough affordable housing near transit. And so somehow or another, we need to address that, because without equity criteria in place, we're going to just work to displace people that aren't protected from being able to capitalize and benefit from these future investments.
Thanks so much, Joel.
Well, I think that I've shared many more times than others, but I'll just kind of wrap it up. Greenbelt Alliance generally supports transportation investments that create equitable, sustainable infill development, that avoids impacts on natural and agricultural lands, that proactively invests in conservation and smart planning, and directs funding to competitive options for transit, walking, biking that are accessible to all people. And on this form, we've indicated where we feel like more funding needs to get there, and we've indicated funding reductions in places that run counter to smart growth and ways to avoid impacts on our natural and agricultural lands that are so special. And at this point, we hope there are more discussions around, as we all know this is a draft, but right now it's not quite aligned with the things that we'd like to see for a balanced and transformative system. So looking forward to more conversation.
Thank you so much, Joel. Ron.
Yeah, there have been a lot of really knowledgeable folks who've talked about a variety of issues as we've gone around the table here, and they fall into different categories of interest and cumulative need for the community. I take a look at this kind of and think about three things. I think about the economy, I think about the environment, and I think about everyone. And those are three legs of a stool that I think that this measure ought to be thinking about and addressing in our ultimate decisions about how we use this money. The other thing that crosses my mind is that we all know that this is an overlapping measure to our existing half-cent transportation sales tax. It's not like we're being pressured and pressed because our current one is running out. Right now, we're going to have a 17-year overlap. And I recognize that there are some things we need to deal with that are current and today, and they need our attention and fixing that are in place. But boy, I think this is an opportunity to use some of this money, this overlapping money, to get out ahead of some of the problems we know are here, that we see are coming, to take a look at the new ways of addressing the economy, protecting the environment, and taking care of the myriad of human social needs that exist for all of the people who live in this area. So I'm a little highfalutin here and not talking about the specific funding categories, but I wish we were really focusing on some of those higher level vision and goals, and then setting some priorities related to those three things in balance that then led us to making the decisions about the funding categories, but all of it's got to then be supported by the things I have talked about, which are the policies that we are going to be putting into place that help us to accomplish quality communities and creating vibrant, economically sustainable communities where people want to live and walk and not be so dependent on more freeways and traffic and car and single occupancy vehicles. So that's kind of my rambling. Sorry.
Thank you.
So my position is really informed by three principles of mobility, accessibility, and technology. For me, mobility is the freeways that are the spines of our system in Contra Costa, particularly 680 and 24. But I would go on to say that in the future, we'll probably have 680, 24, 24, 4, 80, and the East County loop. Accessibility, BART, buses, paratransit, bikes and trails, those are all important issues to feed into interconnectivity within cities and also to feed into our major spines. And lastly, technology. As I was coming into San Francisco, the Bay Area, the other night, I looked down on the freeway system and I saw on 880 cars traveling at 80 miles an hour and cars traveling at 50 miles an hour. I was with my 4-year-old grandson, and I thought, you know, when he's my age, he's going to look down and say, isn't it crazy that they let people drive at any speed they wanted to drive 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Because in the future, technology will control the speed with which vehicles travel on freeways, the distance between vehicles, when they can turn. These are going to be throughways that are going to be highly controlled by technological mechanisms. Now, the issue that comes forward then is how do we get people in the last mile to and from those major arterials? And we'll have to be thinking about that through technological advances. So insofar as excesses are concerned, I think that we're spending far too much on local streets and roads, particularly when you think about layering on the line items that are going to be shared amongst local governments. And I also think while BART is really important, that we're spending more there, we're bearing a greater share of our burden there than we ought to. But I don't want to dismiss the importance of that as a major linkage in our area.
Terrific. Very articulate expression of a lot of the things that have been talked about for quite some time. What we wanted to do is just highlight if you can get me what we have now, okay? And I don't think there's a point in going over what's been said. It's been said very well, and it's certainly going to be part of what we take and assemble and provide for the board for their consideration. Why don't I just if you want to close up, I can just, after you're finished, then I can just highlight the results of the little mini survey that we did.
All right, well, thanks. Give our folks a little bit of time to pull this together. Really reiterate what I said at the beginning here. Just pay attention over the next 3 weeks as these same matters get discussed at the CCTA board meeting. I know that many of you will, hopefully you all follow that. Many of you will attend and participate in those discussions. So please do that if you have the time to attend our meetings. And again, we will be continuing to work on a lot of the things we've talked about here today, addressing some of the holes, some items that we know are we've just said we know that need to be updated. Probably the most notable being the growth management program and the urban limit line. And we'll send out regular communications on the discussions that occur at the CCTA board meeting, and we will regather as a group Sometime in April, April 7th. Yes. Wow, I'm starting to remember.
Okay, so our next meeting is April 7th. Just to give you a highlight,
Thank you.
with regard to the 20 categories, they were really split amongst almost all of them, with the transit and interchange improvements along I-80 and the BART capacity access getting the most noted, but the ones behind were not very far behind. With regard to the people who talked, for those who filled out the number of people who marked the categories for more funds, the transportation for seniors, bike ped and East County corridor, improving traffic flow on 680 and I-80 were marked, but again, almost all of the ones in the category. In terms of taking funds away, and maybe we forgot about the zero-sum game here, the one that hit the most numbers for reducing was local streets and maintenance and improvements. And then there was a big drop to East County corridor, non-rail transit, and ped bike. If you folks want to take a look at this is again not the be-all and end-all, but just a little way that we can get a sense of where people are. I want to thank everybody for sticking around and all the really great input we got. It is very helpful. Thank you.